This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
Imagine an America where it's a constitutional right of someone to end their own lives. Not only that, but that family members will be prohibited from interfering. And a church that can only be allowed to gather if it passes a certain minimum requirement test of tolerance. We're not that far away from that in America, and our guest today has written a couple of books which purportedly are fiction, but seemed very, I hesitate, but almost prophetic in kind of predicting where we are in America today. Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. Our guest was a previous guest on this program, but 6 years ago, after I first discovered his, ostensibly science fiction novel published by Bain. Back in 2014 is when I found it, but the book has been around for longer than that. The book Wolf Time and a follow-up book set in the same city called Death's Doors project ahead. And America today looks a lot like what he predicted in those novels. He's the author of historical fiction. He describes himself as a former Viking. And I am now reliably informed because I bothered to read his website that his the correct pronunciation of his first name is Lars, not Lars, and he was very gracious in not correcting me the last time we spoke. It is an honor to welcome back to the program Lars Walker. Lars, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be here.
It's so. What's a nice Norwegian boy like you doing with an Irish name like Walker?
My great grandfather changed his name. The name in Norway and the whole business of naming in Norwegian culture before modern times is too complicated to go into. But the name in Norway was Kvalavåg, which no one can spell or pronounce in America. So he changed his name to Walker.
Mm. Well, we discovered just within the last 12 months that my Swedish ancestors who emigrated from Finland in the 1860s were named Gilberg rather than Gilbert, which of course was very funny to our daughter, who was a big fan of the WWE back in the day, and they had a comic wrestler by the name of Gilberg who was making fun of some guy named Goldberg. Anyway, so yeah, we that's our ancestry. Like many, I think. Found that their surnames got changed when they arrived at Ellis Island. The novel that I first fell across, and again, it was just I was going through the Bain Books website, BAEN, and found at the time back in 2014 that your novel Wolf Time was being offered, I think, to read for free on the website. It's not that way anymore, but that's where I first discovered your work and was really impressed then, not only by your your accurate prediction of where America was going, but your ability to weave together Norse cosmology with Christian theology, and that mixed with social commentary and where we were going as a church that is a body of believers that is getting more and more liberal, looking more and more like the culture around us. What was it that you saw in America when you began writing Wolf Time and then Death's Doors that compelled you to put all of that down in a fictional setting?
Well, when I started Wolf Time, actually that story goes back to about 1974 when I graduated from college. It started as a short story at that time and metastasized over time into the novel you see today. And it took about 25 years thinking and working about it before it was finally published. But it was, I have always had this squint where I tend to cite along the line of current events and figure, well, where are these leading to? And I find that most of the time there aren't a lot of surprises. Sometimes there are surprises, thank God, and I'm praying that there will be surprises in the future. But usually what's going on now is a fairly good indicator of what is happening and what is going to happen in the future. And I've had a close association with, without naming names, a certain Lutheran church body, which I grew up in, and which has gone through a couple of mergers since I was a little boy, and is now part of a much larger church body. And I felt like I was particularly concentrating what was happening in this church body, and it just seemed obvious to me that if this is happening now, certain things will follow, and of course they have. And I do that with society too, but I was particularly paying attention to the church. And this is something I have said before in other contexts. When we think about the end times and are we in the end times, I've always been a little skeptical. I've been skeptical of setting dates and identifying things with events in Revelation. But one thing seems very clear to me, and that is that one new thing has appeared in our time that we have never seen before, and that is the apostasy of most of the church. Your mainline church bodies are one after another abandoning the basic confessional creedal statements. I mean, not merely the inerrancy of Scripture, which was a lost cause in a lot of places a long time ago, but even the basic beliefs in the divinity of Christ, the physical resurrection, the Trinity. These things are going by the wayside, and we've never seen that before in church history. We've seen the church corrupted, but we have never seen the church simply turn its back on its basic beliefs. And this I find very troubling and suggestive.
It was an interesting choice then in Wolf Time that one of your protagonists is a pastor, Harry Gunderson. And I've got to say that I'm not sure why. When I read this in 2014, I really enjoyed the novel and found it very insightful. But for some reason, I read it this time and I found it more impactful. Especially Harry's, not wanting to give anything away for the storyline, but the course of his story through the novel, and for his sister as well. Harry, correct me if I'm wrong, seems to me to represent the old guard of where we used to be as a body, and the younger pastrix under whom he serves, representing the kind of the new direction, and her story leading to what seemed to me a rather logical end.
Yes, and I wrote him with a couple of friends in mind who were pastors in this church, which shall remain nameless. And it was kind of, I was hoping to encourage them. I've been frankly disappointed with my pastor friends over the years, and I fear that they are not as much like Harry as I hope they would be. The what shall I say, the seductiveness of being in the majority, of being on the winning side, seems to have tremendous power, even for pastors who have been faithful in the past, which breaks my heart.
It is seductive. The irony, and what you have focused on, the study of the history of the Viking Age. I have focused on Mesopotamian cosmology since last we spoke, and have come to realize that what we're moving back to in the modern world is simply a return to the days before Moses came down Mount Sinai. What he was given on or about, in or about 1446 BC or somewhere in that vicinity was actually pretty progressive because it was a radical change from the way people were living in Mesopotamia back in that day. It's like the old song, everything old is new again.
Yeah, and that's really old is new again. And I think I think you're correct. We're walking away from some very basic, hard-bought truths that we learned and that have saved a lot of lives over time, and we seem to be walking back towards something like H.P. Lovecraft.
Yeah, I've done some reading on Lovecraft and his teachings as well. In fact, I wrote a book in which I brought him into the modern UFO phenomenon, because believe it or not, what inspired Eric von Daniken was the work of Lovecraft that had been kind of cycled through a couple of other authors between Lovecraft and von Daniken. The Happy Endings Clinic is a plot point that you use in both Wolf Time and in Death's Doors. I've just started rereading that again. Death's Doors begins with a father, single father, who is a freelance author, and he's got a daughter who's a teen and having had a troubled time in her life. You know, our daughter's 30 years old, and I remember her black period, where everything had to be black. She thankfully got through that without too many issues and too much trouble. But the world that you created around the small town of Epsom, Minnesota, which is sort of ground zero for these stories, this is part of the America that you envision for the future, where and we're starting to see this come about in stories on the West Coast, where you've got several states out west now where assisted suicide is legal. And this may have been what started nudging me back towards rereading your work, Lars, is that because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we're seeing cases in Oregon and in California where people are consulting with these assisted suicide doctors who are supposed to sign off on the paperwork, who aren't even meeting with these people face to face. So they're being assisted towards ending their own lives because of this, without ever actually meeting this person and consulting with this person in the same room. It's being done by video conference. Again, when you started writing these novels back in the day, what did you see in our culture that led you to conclude that this was a logical direction for our culture if we didn't change our ways?
I was heavily informed at the time. I was thinking about when I was thinking out Death's Doors in particular. I was influenced by listening to a lot of James Dobson on Focus on the Family, mm-hmm. and he was pointing out a lot of things that were going on, and this just seemed to me so obvious in dealing with the question of assisted suicide. How many people are you aware of? How many people are there out there who have gone through periods when they sincerely wanted to commit suicide, and for one reason or another, they didn't. And later on, they were so thankful because life got better. And yet we are, if you make suicide a right, how do you stop that? How do you tell a person it will get better? When I know I suffer from depression, I've struggled with depression all my life. Mm. And I know that in those dark days, you don't listen to those voices. They make no sense. Still, when you are suicidal, that you are experiencing the greatest cloud in your life. You see things very sharply, and it is obvious that there is no hope. And you cannot understand the irrational or telling you things will get better. and this suicide business strikes me as it is one of the things there's a statement in one of Walker Percy's novels, The Thanatos Syndrome, which is not directly applicable, but it's suggestive. He says the sentimental ones always end up gassing Jews, one of the characters. And I think the sentimental policies, sentimental public policies, so often end up causing people to get killed because sentiment is fine in its place, but you don't make rational decisions on the basis of sentiment. You have to make them on the basis of morality and rationality.
Mm. And we've seen a culture now that has embraced the idea that suffering is unacceptable. Any type of suffering, I think that you could argue is what's behind the lockdown and during this COVID crisis. But when death is now considered an acceptable treatment for suffering of any type, not just physical suffering, but emotional suffering, we're seeing this happen in Europe. What you wind up with are these happy endings clinics and the confrontation in Wolf Time where Pastor Harry Gunderson has to go to his senior pastor and demand answers why the senior pastor allowed a young girl, teenage girl, which is a time when all of us are confused and struggling, to go off to the happy endings clinic instead of counseling her and hopefully, convincing her that there are things that are worth living for.
It's the same as the business of sex changes for young people, getting sex change surgery at a time when their bodies are changing and they are full of confusion. We allow them to make these life-changing decisions that they may very well regret in the future, and no one has the courage to stand in the way of the sentimentalists.
Hmm. And yeah, Wesley J. Smith does some excellent work in this regard. He's been writing and warning about this for a long, long time. So this was, and maybe again, this was why Wolf Time impacted me more this time than it did 6 years ago before I really started diving deeply into this. There's another aspect of Wolf Time that I thought was really wonderful and instructive, and that is the sacrificial aspect, not just of Harry Gunderson, but of a couple of the other characters in there. The protagonist of the novel, let me ask you this, the protagonist, Karl Martell. Now, I know enough history to recognize the name from Frankish history, especially after doing the research I did for my book on the spiritual sources of Islam. And the victory of Charles Martel at Tours was instrumental in preserving Western civilization. But Karl Martell at the beginning of Wolf Time is not a believer, or at least he thinks he's not a believer. Why did you choose to make a character who regarded himself as an atheist the hero of the novel?
Well, it's kind of a truism that a hero has to have a journey. And I wanted part of Karl's journey to be a journey into faith. So you have to start him outside of faith to do that. I wanted him to, in confronting the moral evils which he, as a decent agnostic, can recognize, I want him to discover the spiritual implications as well.
It was interesting because his arc was very believable, and the moment where he declares his faith was like, it was well written because it surprised himself, but I think the reader will see that was kind of where he was going anyway. Not like a lot of the Christian Bookseller Association type novels where the conversion is sort of mandatory. This was just sort of a natural progression of the character as he was written all through the book, one who stood for honor and truth. And ultimately, when you stand for truth and don't bend on it, you're going to wind up having to acknowledge that there is one capital T truth, and that is Jesus Christ.
Yeah, there's a story. If I can just share an anecdote here.
Sure.
Not long ago, an aspiring writer, Christian writer, contacted me on Facebook, and he said, "What do you do to prevent your book from being just a standard triumphalist story where good wins out and evil is overcome and everything is black and white?" And my answer was, and this the way I've always tried to construct my stories, is that victory, you can have a happy ending, but it always has to have a cost. When the hero gains something, he has to lose something. There's a sacrifice involved.
And certainly that is true in Wolf Time. And like I said, I'm in the process of rereading Death's Doors and looking forward to getting back into Hailstone Mountain and then the other stories there. But let's use this to transition into the your use of Norse cosmology in Wolf Time. And the way you actually managed to work Norse eschatology into Christian eschatology, and the fact that this got published by a mainstream science fiction publisher still blows my mind. When you began, let's backtrack a little bit. Your interest in Viking history, when did that migrate into a study of Norse cosmology and your comparison then to Christian theology?
Oh, it just goes back to my childhood. I tell people that if we'd had video games back then, I would probably have become a video game geek. But we didn't, so I had to come up with my own romance, and I latched on to the Vikings and just read everything I could find, and that naturally read. Actually, I discovered the Norse gods before I discovered the Vikings, and I hardly made a connection between them for a long time. But I did read them and studied them and found them interesting and evocative. And when you spend time with stuff, you see connections, you see parallels, you see how one thing can be folded into another.
Norse cosmology. Just curious now, have you either read the novel or seen the series based on the novel, American Gods by Neil Gaiman?
I haven't watched the series. I did read the book.
Okay.
I'm a little bitter about American Gods because it came out at almost the same time that Wolf Time came out. And it seems to me there was not room in the American market for two novels about Odin in the modern world in the same year. And so he won that toss.
Yeah. Well, his approach toward it was probably going to be more palatable to most mainstream readers. What was your opinion of Gaiman's depiction of Odin?
It's not bad. I like that. I like the fact that his Odin is a little shabby, a little sleazy, because the Odin of the Eddas, the original Norse poems that are our sources for what we know. In the Eddas, he is a bit of a sleazy character. He is not the noble Odin of the Thor movies. He is great and powerful and wise in the heathen understanding of wisdom, which has nothing necessarily to do with virtue. And he has nothing necessarily to do with virtue. He does what he does for his own reasons. He is a liar. He will betray his own followers. It is a common complaint in the skaldic poems that Odin will betray those who follow him. He is not to be relied on. And Gaiman's Odin is kind of like that. And I appreciated that. I liked the fact that he involved a lot of interesting sites in America, like the House on the Rock in Wisconsin, which I visited a couple of times. I enjoyed that element. Otherwise, I didn't love the book. It didn't make a lot of sense to me in a lot of ways.
No, I agree with you there. The best thing about the televised version is Ian McShane as Odin, but Ian McShane is worth watching in anything that he's in. So
exactly.
In Death's Doors, you bring in an element, a group that, and forgive my pronunciation, Mimershof? Or
Mimershof.
Mimershof, yeah. Okay. Who was Mimir in Norse cosmology? What was his relationship to Odin? He
does relate to Odin. Mimir is a giant who in the Norse mythology, giants aren't necessarily big. They're often the same size as the gods, but you're never really sure what size the gods are. Either they're big sometimes and small sometimes. Depends on the needs of the story. Mimir is a giant who is very wise, and he lives at a well, which anyone who drinks from the well will have complete wisdom, complete knowledge. And Odin goes to Mimir and asks for a drink from the well, and Mimir asks him for his eye, one of his eyes, in return. And so Odin plucks out the eye, and that's why he's one-eyed, and gives it to Mimir. And then he drinks from the well, and then he knows everything. He knows the future. He knows how he will die. He knows how everyone will die, which is probably why he's not a particularly happy god.
So that's quite a difference from the way God has revealed himself through his prophets and through, himself as Jesus Christ. And yet we're seeing in Europe a resurgence of the pagan beliefs. As we move into a post-Christian world, it's not returning, or it's not moving into an age of reason, much to the chagrin of people like the neo-atheists, and of course I'm forgetting the name of the most prominent.
I'm thinking of Dawkins.
Yes, Richard Dawkins. Thank you. We're moving into a neo-pagan world, and it is a little puzzling to me why modern people would find a better alternative in their minds in gods like Odin or the ancient gods of the Greeks and Romans. In some cases, I've even seen some people who profess to be going back and worshiping the old Canaanite gods. How prevalent is this? Do you think where we're seeing people dissatisfied with the way the modern church is going and returning to these old gods?
Yeah, it is ironic, isn't it, that as you mentioned, the old atheists thought that when they brought in a new atheist age, it would be an age of reason, but it's not an age of reason. It's an age of irrationality and despair. And there has been a comprehensive campaign going on since the time of the Enlightenment to badmouth Christianity. And what the people who did that, the original rationalists, didn't understand is that when they ate Christianity up, it would eat up rationality too. G.K. Chesterton saw that very clearly. He didn't say specifically when men stop believing in God, they won't believe in nothing, they will believe in anything. But that sentiment is repeated again and again in Chesterton. He lived, back in the early part of the 20th century, but he saw it coming clearly, and he was entirely correct.
We've taken to watching the latest reboot of the Father Brown series from the BBC, which
I saw a couple of those. I do not like them.
Yeah,
they are not Chesterton's.
No, that's true. That's true. No, that's true. That's true. We like the actor who's portraying Father Brown because he played one of our favorite characters in Doctor Who for a couple of episodes, but we do enjoy the fact that they at least allowed him to continue to try to witness to people in the series, which is a little surprising for television being made in the 21st century, especially in the UK. The transition from the pagan world to the Christian world, or the Christian worldview, rather, in Scandinavia must have been pretty traumatic because they're not really mutually compatible in a lot of ways. And that's the source of material for, and forgive me, I'm not going to pronounce this at all correctly, Erling Skjalgsson.
Erling Skjalgsson.
Okay. All right. Well, I've come from Sweden, so what do I know? But it's too many generations between me and the old country. In your research, how traumatic or how difficult was it to Christianize or preach the gospel in the lands that had produced the Vikings?
Well, this is something that I've been dealing with recently, and I have somewhat changed my thinking. We have a book called Heimskringla, which was written in the 13th century, and it's a marvel in Iceland, and it's a marvelous work of literature. And it tells the story of the Viking kings of Norway and the two Olafs who appear in my novels. Olaf Tryggvason is in The Year of the Warrior. They are portrayed as missionary kings who came into Norway and pretty much just laid down the law. Everyone must be converted or they will be killed. And that is the way it has been portrayed for a long time. Mm-hmm. I am actually coming over to a more recent view, which is that a lot of that was propaganda in a strange way. For people in the Middle Ages, the picture of a missionary king coming in and forcibly converting people at the point of a sword was kind of appealing. They liked that idea, and they admired kings who did that. Although it is, it's not defensible in terms of the actual teachings of Christianity. So the feeling among more recent scholars, and there are archaeological reasons and historiographic reasons for believing this. The view of more recent historians is coming over to an idea that those stories were, if not entirely made up, they were exaggerated. What seems to have happened in Scandinavia, and I am indebted to a large extent to a Swedish historian named Anders Vinroth, who has written about this. And I don't agree with Vinroth on everything, but I think he is essentially right. That what actually happened was that the missionaries came in and they spoke to the kings. And the kings immediately recognized that Christianity was useful to them politically. It provided a view of the king which was higher than that of the traditional Norse. The traditional Norse kingship had been a limited thing. Christianity offered the possibility, anyway, of a view of the king where he's like a high priest and has and speaks for God, so that disobeying the king is disobeying God. And we've seen many kings in the Middle Ages operate that way. So these Scandinavian kings in the Viking Age really immediately recognized that if they could convince people of this view of kingship, it would enhance their power. And also that the Christian church came equipped with a prefabricated bureaucracy, which they could turn to their own purposes for taxation, for instance. And so there were great benefits to a king in making his kingdom Christian. So what Vinroth and others suggest is that the king simply did that. They declared, I am now a Christian. They got baptized. They said, we're all Christians now. In order to bring that through, they probably would have had to do some coercion on some of their chief, the leadership, the chieftains of the country. They would have offered them inducements, first of all. They would have threatened them next. They might have tortured some of them. They might have killed some of them. That probably did happen, but only in a limited way and only among the very highest strata of society. The ordinary people in the country probably barely noticed the change at the time. But as time went on, priests came in, were installed, built churches, taught them the Christian faith, and they were gradually acculturated to it. So that the whole thing was not as dramatic and violent as the sagas would have us tell. The sagas love exciting stories. The reality was probably not as real, not as violent. But I wasn't aware of that when I was writing The Year of the Warrior. I have... So I was going on the old view. In my more recent Erling books, I am writing more about another thing that some historians point out. Vinroth rejects this. But the idea that in Norway, an earlier king had a lot more to do with Christianizing the country than the two Olafs, the missionary kings. He was a king who I mention in The Year of the Warrior. He was dead for some time then. His name was Håkon the Good. And he had actually been raised in England at the court of the King of England, whose name escapes me at the moment. But he was raised as a Christian, and he came to Norway, according to the sagas, with the purpose of converting them in a peaceful way. Because the Anglo-Saxon church at that time had a missionary policy which was based on kindness, understanding, and gradualism. And there is archaeological reason to believe that Håkon was a lot more successful than the sagas give him credit for. The sagas treat him as a failed missionary. And a more modern view is suggesting that he was actually a lot more successful in large parts of Norway than the sagas give him credit for, but he was set aside by the saga writers because they wanted to glorify the two Olafs, especially the second Olaf, Saint Olaf, who appears in my novel, The Elder King, because he became the patron saint of Norway.
Okay. The Book of Knowledge, otherwise known as Wikipedia, Ethelstan of England was the king.
Yes, it was Athelstan the Great. Yes, they called him Håkon Athelstan's foster because he was fostered up at the home of Athelstan.
Okay, yeah. Now Håkon, there's another Håkon that appears in Death's Doors. That's Jarl Håkon. What's the relationship between those two? I'm just curious.
Håkon the Good's chief supporter and best friend in Norway was Jarl Håkon's father, Sigurd, who was the Jarl of up on the Trondelag, which is further north from where Erling lived, and Håkon was actually named. Jarl Håkon was actually named after King Håkon.
Okay, all right. So this transition was perhaps less bloody than the sagas would have it. How did it change? And I ask this because, again, having done some research for my book on the spiritual sources behind Islam, stumbled onto some information that appears that you've already known, which was the connection between the Muslims on the Mediterranean and Viking slave traders. How did the Christianizing of Scandinavia change their overall culture? I mean, presumably, for example, they weren't selling slaves from Ireland to the Ottoman Empire anymore.
Yes, officially at least, that stopped as the Scandinavian countries became Christianized. The trade tragically did continue, but they hunted their slaves in the Slavic areas of Eastern Europe, and so that went on for a while. Although it did collapse during the Viking Age, the silver mines in Afghanistan played out, and so the Baghdad Caliphate didn't have as much money to spend, so that slave trade died out some. But there was a lot of contact between the Vikings and the Caliphate. A lot of business done back and forth, and most of it, very sadly, in slaves. Yeah,
and I was speaking in anachronisms there. The Ottoman Empire wasn't founded until the beginning of the 14th century, so that's would have been too late for that. But the Viking influence into Eastern Europe and is more extensive than most of us realize. The original Russian kingdom, the Kievan Rus, were essentially Vikings, were they not?
Yes, they were Swedes. They came in. It's still disputed how many of them came, whether it was just a few members of a ruling class who came in and simply took over as rulers. They certainly, what's the word? Acculturated very quickly and became very Slavic in their language and customs fairly early. But they were it was founded by Russians, by Swedes.
The Scandinavians, Vikings, seem to be pretty good at that. Colonies set up in the UK, or the British Isles, and as far east as what is now Ukraine and Russia, and trading all the way down to the Mediterranean with the Islamic Caliphate based out of Baghdad. It's really remarkable that they're not the way they're depicted, and yet, at least until the people accepted the teachings of Christianity to some degree, these are probably not the people you'd want setting up the kingdom next door.
No, they were, yeah. They were, what shall I say? I'm not sure. I had a thought and I'm losing it.
Well, I'm with you. It's that point in the afternoon where the blood sugar begins to drop. It's time for the afternoon tea to kind of kick things back up again. But again, just to kind of wrap things up, where do you see us going from here? To bring it back to your novels, Wolf Time and Death Stores, again, written some time ago, and kind of projecting to a not very distant future from where we are at this moment, with death clinics actually now inside the United States, approved by various state governments out on the West Coast. The Defense of Religion Act that you include in the novels. Federal law limiting freedom of worship to faith groups meeting minimum standards of tolerance. We were almost there during the Obama administration, where they were trying to redefine the freedom of religion to freedom of worship. Do what you want on Sunday morning or Saturday or Wednesday night, but don't take it outside your church walls. Where do you see us going from here if we don't change direction?
Well, that is the big question, isn't it? What concerns me, when I was writing, it seemed to me there were many possible futures. Now it seems to me we are down to a couple of hard choices. A while back, I was, praying to God to turn our, to save us, to turn our hearts to Him. And the question occurred to me, why should He? if we think of ourselves as people who've ever been in any kind of a covenant with God, and I don't say that we have ever been in the same kind of covenant as Israel, but it seemed to me there was a time when we felt ourselves as a people of God. If we ever presumed on that, that condition doesn't exist anymore. We have either the choice of returning around, repenting, or facing disaster. We are rapidly catching up to our own contradictions and drowning in our contradictions, and that which cannot go on will not go on. Something is going to change. And I'm not a brave man. This scares me, but I fear a crisis moment is coming.
Mm. The novels that we've been discussing during this discussion are the two that I have read. There's a third that I've read, Hailstone Mountain, which I'll be rereading and then going back and reading all of it. And you forgive me the pronunciation again, the Erling Skjalgsson series. 5 novels so far, and the author, Lars Walker, online, larswalker.com. He blogs at brandywinebooks.net. There'll be links to those websites in the show notes. Lars, I have to say, I think you're right. The older I get, the more I feel like Harry Gunderson in Wolf Time. But we know, at least from the end of the book, that things will turn out. It's just, I think that the emotion that hit me in reading Wolf Time was in recognizing that there are people around us who just are blind to what is happening to them, don't know what's happening to them, and yet the truth is right in front of their eyes if they would just open them and look. And I'm with you in praying that the Lord will help some of those eyes be open before it's too late.
I always go back to the book of Proverbs, where the woman wisdom is walking through the streets saying, "All who hate me love death."
Mm. Very true. Lars, thanks very much for your time today. I sure appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
You'll find links in the show notes to Lars's website, larswalker.com, his blog site where he and a partner blog at brandywinebooks.net. And I see that his fellow blogger there is a fan of barbershop quartet music, which means I insist you visit brandywinebooks.net. And I'll also include a link to banebooks.com. By the way, I don't mean that tongue in cheek, actually. Sung with the Barbershop Harmony Society since 1978, off and on. So check it out. I'll also include a link to banebooks.com, where you can get a free sample of the novel that prompted the conversation with Lars, and the first conversation, which I'll link to in the notes as well, back in 2014. Wolf Time, a novel published in 1999. Bain Books, still at the website, has the prologue and the first 4 chapters available to read for free. So you get a chance to see what I'm talking about here and how accurately Lars projected ahead. I hate to hesitate to use the word prophetic, but it's almost eerie how 20 years ago he saw where our culture was going to be today in terms of happy endings clinics and the social justice movement, which is not far from what he depicted in Wolf Time, and did it in the context of a very entertaining story that manages to work in Norse eschatology, Christian eschatology, and occult references, along with characters that you really care about. And you'll find it moving, especially if you've got some years on you. Even just in the 6 years between the time I first read it and now, the reread hit me more deeply than it did the first time through, especially the character of the Lutheran pastor, Harry Gunderson. So check that out. Links in the notes, and straight ahead, details on a couple of conferences coming up and a few final thoughts as A View from the Bunker continues. COVID-19 has changed everything. Because of the coronavirus, we can't bring the sold-out Defender Conference to Branson this year. So we decided, if we can't bring the conference to Branson, we'll bring it to you instead. Skywatch TV's 2020 Defender Conference is going virtual. If you thought you were going to miss out because you couldn't travel to Branson this year, or because the conference sold out too quickly, now see and hear world-class speakers, cutting-edge presentations in the comfort of your own home. And to make it better, we're adding new speakers like Steve Quayle and New York Times best-selling author Joel Richardson. And don't miss what Tom Horn says will be his last conference presentation ever. Plus, we'll add all of the presentations from the 2019 Defender Conference, so you're getting 2 conferences for the price of 1. Sign up now. Skywatch TV's 2020 Defender Conference. Virtual, but bigger than ever. It goes live August 27th, 2020. For information and registration, log on to defenderconference.com. That's defenderconference.com.
Shall we begin? Let's begin now.
Talking the walk every Sunday night from the beautiful Missouri Ozarks. This is A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. You'll find us online at vftb.net. Of course, the easiest way, the free way to follow us is to download our free mobile app for Android and iOS devices. Links to those app stores are posted at the website, vftb.net. Online, Twitter, at @ViewFromBunker, or my personal Twitter feed, at Derek Gilbert. That's generally where I post things that come into my head. You'll find us on Facebook as well, and Parler.com, Parler, Parler.com. The handle there is Derek P. Gilbert. We are in as weird a year as I have lived through in my 58 years on this planet. I mean, yeah, I survived the 60s as a kid in Chicago. So, the 68 Democratic Convention, I was too small, too young to remember any of that. This is as strange a year as I can recall. And it is a time of testing, to be sure. What happens in November? Whatever happens in November, whatever follows the election is probably not going to be very enjoyable. News reported last week put out the word that back in June, a group got together in Washington, D.C. to wargame what would happen if President Trump refused to give up power after the election. And what would happen if the election was close and he decides not to step down? Or what happens if the election is contested because of mail-in ballots? Or what happens if he wins the Electoral College? I like the way the media reported this. What happens if he wins the Electoral College, which by definition means wins the election, because that's how we decide the winner in the United States. But the way they phrased it, what happens if he wins the Electoral College but loses the popular vote by 5% or something? Now, Democrats, anti-Trumpers, upset at losing a third presidential election in recent memory, where the winner lost the popular vote, which again is not how we pick the president. And there are reasons, good reasons, for not choosing the president based on popular vote. What will the president do? What will Democrats do? And in this war game scenario where it was generally Washington insiders and media types, very incestuous group, where Republicans played Republicans, Democrats played Democrats, etc. In this scenario, one of the scenarios where Trump wins the Electoral College, Biden wins the popular vote, John Podesta, who was Hillary Clinton's campaign chair, played the role of the vice president and refused to step down. And in this scenario, where they used a 10-sided die to determine whether specific actions were successful or not, in that scenario, the West Coast of the United States threatened to secede without some democratic reforms, like let's choose the next president based on popular vote or something. So California, Washington, Oregon, in this war game scenario, threatened to secede. And so the House of Representatives, controlled by Democrats, voted to install Joe Biden as president. The Senate sided with the president. And so everybody sat back to wait and see what the military would do. So again, just bear in mind, this was just a war game scenario, similar to the simulations that were run based on pandemics within the last few years. But interesting that the media reported on this a month after the fact, just to sort of let us know that idea is rattling around in Washington, D.C. now. What happens if there is a crisis, a constitutional crisis after November's election? Well, what do we do as Christians about it? That's another thought. Rather than discuss that in full here, just start pondering that, turn to the scriptures and see. And remember, our main objective, our main goal as Christians on this earth is to spread the gospel, to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. And sadly, as we see from recent surveys and public declarations by various denominations, a lot of Christians or so-called Christians now believe that our Great Commission is to spread social justice. That is among our tasks on this earth, to take care of the orphaned, the widow, the sojourner, the poor. But our main objective is to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, to make disciples of all nations. We are all sinners in need of salvation. And sadly, as recent research shows, most American Christians now believe that we have to earn our way into heaven by doing more good than bad. That is astonishing and sad, because that's Christianity 101. You are saved by grace alone, through faith alone, in Jesus Christ alone. There is nothing you can do to earn your way into heaven. Nothing. And if a majority of professing American Christians believe that that is how you get to heaven, by doing good, well, it's hard to take back the country when we've already lost our churches, Christians. So let's concentrate on that first. Let's get back to the basics. A couple of conference updates quickly. The Skywatch TV Defender Conference launches August 27th. That's just a couple of weeks away. This will be a virtual conference, but instead of streaming them out on a schedule, we're going to release them all for binge watching on August 27th, 2 p.m. Central Time. So this year's conference speakers, including some new speakers who'd not been scheduled to come to the Branson conference before we had to rethink the live in-person conference because of social distancing, COVID-19. Steve Quayle, Joel Richardson, in addition to the rest of the lineup that had already been scheduled, Pat Boone, Pastor Carl Gallups, Dr. Michael Lake, Dr. Mike Heiser, Jakob Bujans, and of course, all of us from Skywatch TV. My presentation clocks in at an hour and 45 minutes. I can't say anything in under than an hour, it seems. So all of that released in one shot, August 27th, included in this all of last year's conference presentations. So if you couldn't attend or didn't sign up for last year's virtual conference, you'll get access to 2 conferences for the price of one for 90 days, beginning August 27th. You find out more and sign up online, defenderconference.com. That's defenderconference.com. And then the first weekend in September, a live in-person event, September 4th through 6th, the Warrior Summit and Retreat. This is simply a weekend of fellowship in a kind of an intimate setting. It's a Christian camp, High Hill Christian Camp in High Hill, Missouri. That's west of St. Louis on Interstate 70, west of Wentzville. So it's kind of a ways out, removed from St. Louis. OmegaDynamics.org. Jamie Walden is putting it together. Sharon and I will be there, along with Coach Dave Daubenmeyer, Dr. Mike Spalding, Tim Alberino, Bob Griswold, Mike Kerr, Jeannie Moore, and of course, Jamie Walden. And you can find out more about the event at OmegaDynamics.org. It looks like a beautiful place, and we're looking forward to it. OmegaDynamics.org. The rest of the conference schedule, we got posted at gilberthouse.org. You'll find that at the same website where Sharon and I host our weekly Bible study. We are into the book of Exodus now. We release a new Bible study every week, usually Sunday midday by the time we get it recorded and uploaded. And we're going through the Bible in chronological order. It took us 5 years to get through it the first time, just about. So God willing, we'll make it through a second time. If he comes before that and puts a stop to the study, we're not going to argue with that. You'll find, again, the Bible study and our upcoming schedule of events at gilberthouse.org. A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House, released under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License. Our announcer is D.C. Good. Next week, Dr. Michael Bennett returns. How then shall we vote? That's coming up August 16th, 2020, here on A View from the Bunker. Remember, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.